The whispers followed Imani like the train of her silk wedding gown, catching on the opulent floral arrangements and clinging to the humid, salt-laced air. They were venomous little things, spoken from behind champagne flutes and delicate paper fans. Look at her. So large. How could the Ishikawagumi leader choose such a woman? The words were in Japanese, but contempt was a universal language. Imani understood it perfectly. She stood beside her new husband, a man carved from ice and shadow, and felt the weight of 1,000 judgments pressed down on her. Her dress, a custom creation of ivory silk that had cost more than her father's entire company, was meant to be a masterpiece. On her full, dark-skinned body, the guests saw only a waste of fabric. They saw her soft arms, her generous hips, her unapologetic presence, and deemed it unworthy of the man at her side. Takashi Ishikawa was absolute. His posture was a blade, his custom-tailored tuxedo a second skin of midnight black. The only hint of the violence that was his birthright was the intricate blue-black ink of a dragon's tail peeking from beneath his starched collar, a silent promise of the beast beneath the bespoke tailoring. He hadn't looked at her, not really, since the ceremony on the beach. His hand rested on the small of her back, a gesture of possession, not affection. It was a brand, staking a claim for all to see. This woman, this outsider, this debt payment in human form, was his. The marriage had been a transaction. Her father's shipping logistics company had made a fatal mistake, crossing a line it shouldn't have, and the debt had come due in blood or gold. Takashi had offered a third option, a bride. An alliance, he'd called it. A union to signal a new, more modern era for his clan. Imani knew what it really was. She was a lock on a door, a guarantee of her father's future compliance. "She looks like she ate the first bride," a woman whispered, her laugh a tinkling, cruel bell. Imani's jaw tightened. She kept her gaze fixed on the endless Pacific horizon, where the sun was melting into the water in streaks of orange and violet. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She had learned long ago that her body was a battleground for other people's opinions. She had learned to be a fortress. Takashi's thumb pressed, just once, against the silk over her spine. A flicker of something, a warning? A command? She couldn't tell. His face was a mask of aristocratic indifference. He moved through this world of polite savagery like a shark in a koi pond, utterly at home, utterly lethal. That was the moment everything changed. It wasn't a shout or a gunshot that broke the spell. It was the music. The string quartet, which had been weaving a delicate melody, faltered. A single violin screeched, a sound of pure panic, before being silenced completely. A woman screamed. A champagne flute shattered on the marble terrace. Imani's head snapped toward the sound. 3 men dressed as waiters were no longer holding silver trays. They were holding pistols, fitted with suppressors that made the gunshots almost polite, a soft thump-thump-thump that was far more terrifying than a roar. Panic erupted. Guests scattered, a wave of silk and jewels cresting in fear. Takashi did not flinch. His hand left her back and clamped around her wrist, his grip a manacle of warm steel. He moved before she could process the chaos, pulling her behind him, his body a solid wall between her and the threat. He moved like the room owed him space. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice a low growl, the first words he had spoken to her in over an hour. Another man, one of Takashi's own, fell with a quiet grunt, a dark flower blooming on his white shirt. The assassins were efficient. They were not aiming for the crowd. They were aiming for him. For them. Takashi's free hand went inside his jacket and emerged with a matte black pistol of his own. The movement was a single, fluid stroke as natural as breathing. He didn't raise it to aim. He held it low, his body a study in predatory stillness. He was scanning, calculating, his dark eyes missing nothing. He saw the 2 assassins moving to flank them, cutting off the exit to the main house. He saw the third one raising his weapon, aiming directly for Imani. What she did not know yet was that he had seen this before. He had lived this nightmare once, and failed. Before Takashi could fire, Imani acted. It wasn't a plan, just pure survival instinct. The heavy, ornate centerpiece on the table beside them, a monstrosity of ice and orchids, was her only weapon. With a surge of adrenaline, she shoved it with all her strength. The massive sculpture crashed to the floor, exploding into a shower of ice shards and water. The assassin aiming for her flinched, his shot going wide, shattering a window behind them. The sound of the breaking glass was the signal for all-out war. Takashi's men, the true soldiers hidden among the guests, returned fire. The air filled with the sharp crack of unsilenced weapons, the polite massacre now a raw, brutal firefight. Takashi didn't praise her or scold her. He simply reacted to the opening she had created. He pulled her through the chaos, his grip on her wrist unbreakable, his body shielding hers from the flying debris and stray bullets. He moved through the violence like it was choreography he had memorized, precise and economical. He was a creature of this element. She was just a tourist who had stumbled into a hurricane. He shoved her through a set of glass doors, into the quiet, cool interior of the beach house, his men forming a perimeter behind them. The silence inside was a living thing, heavy and suffocating after the cacophony outside. They were in a large, minimalist living area decorated in shades of gray and cream. Blood was smeared on his cufflink. It wasn't his. "Are you hurt?" His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but his eyes were scanning her from head to toe, a clinical assessment. "No," Imani managed, her voice trembling slightly. "I've fine." He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. He released her wrist, and the absence of his touch was as shocking as its presence had been. He turned away from her, speaking in rapid, low Japanese into a small radio. Orders were given. A perimeter was secured. Casualties were counted. She stood there, her magnificent dress now feeling like a ridiculous costume. The illusion of a wedding had been stripped away, leaving only the cold, hard reality of what she had married into. A world of tailored suits and silent assassinations. He finished his call and turned back to her. The mask was back in place, but something in his eyes had shifted. He was looking at her now, truly seeing her perhaps for the first time. He was seeing the woman who had not frozen, who had not screamed, who had toppled an ice sculpture to save her own life. "The threat is contained, but not eliminated," he said. They were professionals. And they were inside. The implication was clear. A betrayal. The whispers at the party had been cruel, but this was a different kind of poison, one that came from within his own organization. "We are leaving," he stated. "Not a question. A fact. My personal residence is secure. You will be safe there." Imani simply nodded. She had no other choice. That was the contract. She was his now, in sickness and in health, in polite society and in a hail of gunfire. The ceremony on the beach had been a lie, but the violence that followed was the truest vow of all. That was the moment she understood that her life was no longer her own. It belonged to the cold, lethal man who now held her future in his hands, and she was locked in his world whether she liked it or not. The Ishikawa estate was a fortress disguised as a Zen masterpiece. Nestled in the hills overlooking the city, it was a compound of dark wood, smoked glass, and ancient stone, surrounded by a wall that was both a work of art and a declaration of war. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the soft footsteps of guards on polished floors and the distant cry of a hawk. Takashi led her to a suite of rooms that was larger than her old apartment. It was beautiful, sterile, and cold. A cage, no matter how gilded. For 2 days, she saw him only in passing. He was a ghost in his own home, consumed by the hunt for the traitor in his ranks. Imani was left alone with her thoughts, a prisoner of his protection. On the 3rd day, he came to her room. He did not knock. The door simply opened, and he was there, holding a tablet. He looked tired. The perfect, icy facade had hairline cracks around his eyes. "I need you to look at this," he said, his voice rough. He set the tablet on the low table between them. It showed a 4-way split of security footage from the wedding reception. The chaos. The attack. "My men see a coordinated assault," he said. "They see 3 shooters. I see something else. Imani looked at him, confused. What do you want from me? I'm not one of your soldiers. No, he said, his gaze intense. Your father told me your background. Before his business faltered. You were a risk analyst. For 8 years. You specialized in pattern recognition, finding threats before they materialize. She was stunned into silence. He knew. Of course he knew. He would have learned everything about her before signing the contract. He had not chosen her at random. He had chosen an asset. Look, he commanded, his voice softer this time. She forced herself to focus on the screens, her old professional instincts kicking in. She watched the footage again and again, ignoring the gunfire and the screaming, and focusing on the moments just before. The patterns. The flow of movement. The anomalies. There, she said after nearly an hour, pointing a steady finger at one of the screens. That waiter. He's not one of the shooters. But watch him. On the screen, a man in a waiter's uniform moved calmly through the rising panic. He wasn't running. He wasn't fighting. He was observing. At the precise moment the assassins opened fire, he subtly angled his body, blocking a security camera's view of the terrace entrance. It was a tiny, deliberate movement, easily missed. He created a blind spot. Imani breathed. There was a fourth man, the coordinator. Takashi's eyes narrowed. He looked from the screen to her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than cold calculation. It looked like respect. Kaito, Takashi said, the name a shard of glass in his mouth. His second in command, the man he trusted like a brother. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of betrayal. Takashi stood and walked to the vast window overlooking a meticulously raked gravel garden. The first time this happened, he began, his back to her, his voice low and strained. I was not prepared. I was younger, arrogant. I thought my world was untouchable, he paused. My wife, Akemi, she died. They used the chaos of a celebration to get close. I failed to protect her. It was a failure of honor, a failure of strength, a stain on my name that I have carried for 10 years. This was his wound, the ghost that haunted this silent, perfect house. He carried a shame so deep it had frozen him from the inside out. He wasn't just protecting Imani from assassins. He was fighting the ghost of his own failure. You are not her, he said, turning to face her. His eyes were black holes of memory and pain. And I will not fail again. That night, a different kind of assassin came. A silent one. The air in Imani's suite grew cold, the scent of antiseptic sharp and out of place. Her training as an analyst had taught her to trust her instincts, and they were screaming. She didn't wait. She slipped out of bed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She found the source in the ventilation shaft, a faint hiss. Gas. She didn't scream for help. Kaito would be monitoring the communications. She grabbed the heaviest lamp from the bedside table, wrapped the cord around her hand, and moved to the door. She knew the guard rotations. She knew there was a 5-minute window during the shift change when the hallway would be empty. She held her breath, wrenched the door open, and ran. She bypassed the main corridors, using the service hallways she had mentally mapped during her 2 days of captivity. Her only goal was Takashi's office, the command center of the estate. She found it empty. A cold dread washed over her. Kaito had been thorough. He had isolated them from each other. But he had made one mistake. He had assumed she was helpless. He assumed she was just the fat foreign wife. On Takashi's desk, a single monitor was active, showing a live feed of the estate's perimeter. She saw it instantly, a section of the wall where the thermal sensors were offline. A breach. They were already inside. She could run. She could find a place to hide and wait for this to be over. But she thought of the look in Takashi's eyes when he spoke of Akemi. The raw shame. The vow he had made. She would not be his second failure. Her eyes scanned the office, searching for a weapon, a tool, anything. They landed on a decorative katana displayed on the wall. It was ceremonial, but it was also a pound of sharpened, folded steel. Beneath it was a control panel for the estate's security systems. An idea, desperate and dangerous, sparked in her mind. She wasn't a soldier. She was an analyst. And she would use the system itself as her weapon. She was keying in a command to trigger a lockdown sequence when the door slid open. It wasn't Takashi. It was Kaido, a smug, triumphant smile on his face, a pistol in his hand. "The quiet mouse leaves her cage," he sneered. "I should have known you were more than just a distraction." "You underestimated him," Imani said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And you underestimated me. He is weakened by sentiment," Kaido spat. "First Akemi, now you. His sentiment will be his end." Just as he raised his pistol, the estate's emergency shutters slammed down, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the red glow of the alarm panel, the lockdown she had initiated. Simultaneously, the fire suppression system hissed to life, filling the hallway with thick, disorienting smoke. She didn't wait for him to recover. She lunged, not for him, but for the heavy mahogany desk. Using every ounce of her strength, she shoved it, sending it sliding across the polished floor. It slammed into Kaido's knees, buckling his legs and sending him crashing to the ground. His shot went wild, embedding itself in the ceiling. Imani scrambled for the fallen katana, its weight unfamiliar but solid in her hands. She wouldn't win a real fight, but she didn't have to. The door burst open and Takashi was there, a whirlwind of controlled fury, his own weapon drawn. He took in the scene in a fraction of a second. Kaido on the floor, Imani standing over him, the ceremonial sword held in a clumsy but determined two-handed grip. His eyes met hers over the chaos, and the look in them was shattering. All the ice, all the control, all the distance, it was gone. In its place was a raw, terrifying fear. A fear of being too late. Again. He moved past her and dealt with Kaido with brutal efficiency. There was no honor in it, just the cold finality of a traitor's sentence being carried out. When it was over, he turned back to her. The room was silent save for the blaring alarm. He walked toward her slowly, his gun now hanging loosely at his side. He stopped just before her, his gaze locked on hers. "They will not touch you again," he said, his voice a raw whisper. The words were an echo of what he'd said before, but they meant something entirely different now. It was no longer a statement of intent. It was a confession. "This is no longer about honor. It is about you." He reached out, not to take the sword, but to gently cup her face. His thumb traced her cheekbone, a touch so tender it felt like a brand. She had seen the beast. And now, for the first time, she was being shown the man. She hadn't just survived. She had crossed a line, and in doing so, had dragged him across it with her. She was no longer just his wife, his asset, his debt payment. She was his center, and the entire bloody empire would burn before he let anyone take her from him. The final assault came at dawn. Kaido's remaining loyalists, a small but elite force, threw themselves at the estate in a last, desperate act of vengeance. Gunfire echoed through the serene gardens, turning the raked gravel into a battlefield. Takashi had placed Imani in the estate's central panic room, a titanium-lined vault buried deep beneath the main house. "You will be safe here," he had said, his voice absolute. But as the door sealed shut, she knew safety was no longer the goal. Survival was. And she would not survive by hiding. The panic room was a cage, but it was also a nerve center. A bank of monitors showed her every corner of the compound. She watched as Takashi and his men were pinned down near the western gate, a brilliant pincer movement by the attackers. They were being overwhelmed. They were going to lose. She saw the attackers' leader directing his men, using the blind spots in the security coverage, the same blind spots Kaido had exploited. They thought they were invisible in those pockets. They were wrong. Imani had spent the last day integrating her own protocols into the estate's network. She had created a secondary layer of sensors, ones only she could see. She wasn't a warrior. She was a strategist. And this was her chessboard. A quiet command into the room's microphone redirected the garden's sprinkler system, turning a stone pathway into a sheet of slick, treacherous ice. 2 attackers went down, their ankles snapping. Another command sealed a set of steel shutters, trapping a fire team in a narrow corridor. She watched them on her hidden sensors, a ghostly green outline of their panic. She was systematically dismantling the assault from the inside out, turning the fortress against its invaders. She was a ghost in the machine, her mind the weapon, her intelligence the blade. The leader of the attackers, a man with a vicious scar across his face, realized what was happening. He saw his forces being divided and conquered by an unseen hand. In a stroke of brutal insight, he abandoned the fight with Takashi and led his last 2 men directly toward the main house, toward the panic room. He knew he was coming for the queen. Imani watched them approach on the monitor. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady on the controls. She sealed the doors, rerouted power, did everything she could to slow them down. But they were relentless, using plastic explosives to breach one barrier after another. She looked around the sterile room. There was no escape. There were no weapons. Just technology. And her. When the final titanium door hissed open, she was not cowering in the corner. She was standing in the center of the room, calm and resolute. The 3 men stormed in, weapons raised, their eyes wild with bloodlust. They saw her, this soft, full-figured woman, and a look of contemptuous victory crossed the leader's face. He had her. The boss's pet, he sneered. This will be a message he never forgets. You're right, Imani said, her voice even. It will be. She pressed a final button on the small remote in her hand. It was not connected to the security system. It was connected to the room's ventilation. For the last 10 minutes, she had been flooding the sealed panic room with pure, concentrated nitrogen from the fire suppression reserves. The air had become unbreathable. She had been holding a small, personal oxygen tank hidden behind her back. The men's expressions shifted from triumph to confusion, then to panic. They gasped, their lungs finding nothing to sustain them. They clawed at their throats, their weapons clattering to the floor. They collapsed one by one, their bodies starved of air. It was silent, surgical, lethal. When Takashi finally breached the room moments later, the battle outside won. He found her standing amidst the unconscious bodies of his enemies. She was breathing from the small tank, her chest rising and falling, the only sign of the terror she had pushed through. He stopped, his gun lowering. He looked at the fallen men, then at her. He saw not a victim, not a liability, not a prize to be protected. He saw an equal. He saw the woman who had single-handedly decapitated the force that had nearly destroyed him. The woman everyone had mocked, everyone had dismissed, had just saved his entire empire with nothing but her mind and her will. The cost of their victory was the illusion of loyalty his clan was built on. It was shattered, the trust poisoned forever. He would have to rebuild from the ashes. He walked toward her, his steps slow, deliberate. He did not speak. He simply knelt. It was not a gesture of defeat, but of absolute reverence. He reached out and took the oxygen tank from her hand, his fingers brushing hers. It was an acknowledgement more profound than any words, a transfer of power that changed the foundation of their world. He rose, his eyes holding hers. Imani, he said, and the way he spoke her name was different. It was not the name of his wife. It was the name of his queen. Later, they stood in the ruined garden as the sun rose, casting long shadows over the debris of the battle. The air smelled of cordite and damp earth. He did not apologize for the world he had dragged her into. He did not promise her peace. He offered her the only thing he had left that was real, the truth. He reached for her hand. It was not a command. It was a question. She looked at his hand, then at the devastation around them, and finally at his face. She saw the killer, the leader, the man haunted by his past. But she also saw the man who had knelt before her. She placed her hand in his. The choice was made. She would not be a fortress anymore. She was the storm. And this violent, dangerous world was hers to command, right beside him.